Hello, and welcome to another episode of Balanced Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Dr. Mary T. Newport practiced neonatology in Florida for 30 years and served as a founding medical director for two newborn intensive care units in the Tampa Bay area. Her focus shifted in 2008 when she somewhat famously found a nutritional intervention that supplied ketones as an alternate fuel for the brain for her husband, Steve, with early onset Alzheimer's disease. Steve responded dramatically to consuming medium chain triglycerides, or MCTs, from coconut oil, which produce ketones when consumed. She is the author of several books, including The Complete Book of Ketones, a practical guide to ketogenic diets and ketone supplements, and her latest book, Clearly Keto, for healthy brain aging and Alzheimer prevention, which came out in November of 2022. Dr. Newport is also an international speaker on the subject of ketones as an alternate fuel for the brain, with numerous speaking engagements around the world, and is a certified ketogenic nutrition specialist, a program offered by the American Nutrition Association. You can find her and a wealth of educational resources on her website at www.coconutketones.com. Dr. Mary Newport, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Balanced Body Radio.
Oh, hi, Casey. Thank you so much for having me on your radio program.
It is so exciting to get to talk to you. You are somebody that I have followed along for a very long time. And when I was putting the introduction together, the word I tried to use the most deliberately was somewhat famously. You somewhat famously fed your husband coconut oil and he improved. And I say that because I think if you've been in the low carbohydrate space for a while, you probably have come across that story at some point. But still, that story is just not told enough to the general public. And so few people really understand what's going on with Alzheimer's in the brain. And in fact, I would love to start this discussion by talking about a recent kind of happening that happened in the research community with Alzheimer's research proving to be fraudulent and basically lots of money and time just absolutely wasted by chasing the wrong thing when they knew they were chasing the wrong thing. We hosted Amy Berger on our show, who wrote the Alzheimer's Anecdote, and I asked her the same question that I'm going to ask you, which is, were you surprised at all by knowing that research that was done was all fraudulent?
I was a little surprised that it might have been fraudulent, but I was not surprised at the ramifications that information has had. Because for many years, decades, there have been billions of dollars put into research to try to find drugs that will remove beta amyloid. And it turns out, and there's even other research supporting that the exact opposite may be true. So we can talk about that.
Yeah, I would love to. So what were they? They knew that amyloid wasn't the actual problem. Is that correct? Do I understand that correctly?
It turns out that I think in the fraudulent research that you're referring to, there were some images that appeared to be photoshopped. They were duplicated, and it had to do with another form of beta amyloid that was thought to be possibly toxic. And it really brought attention, I think, more than anything to this area. Many researchers that have been involved with beta amyloid said, well, this has no impact because we're talking about a different type of beta amyloid. However, there is some other brand new research that just came out that I think will have a much greater impact. It just needs to get greater awareness. And this was a group at University of Cincinnati, which happens to be my alma mater.
That's right.
I got to meet one of the authors just earlier this week to talk about all of it. But what they found was, and it's already been known that there's a biomarker for people with Alzheimer's. It's in spinal fluid. And people with Alzheimer's tend to have lower levels of this soluble beta amyloid 42, which is the one that is involved in making the plaques in the brain. And actually, they have low levels of spinal fluid. And what this group did was they had two studies, one published in 2021 and then another in 2022, that really confirmed this, is that they looked at how much beta amyloid plaque was documented in the brain on brain imaging. And you can have a little bit of plaque if you have Alzheimer's, minimal plaque. You can have very dense plaque in the brain. But the thing is that older people that have normal cognition can also have a lot of beta amyloid plaque in the brain. So one question has been, how is that possible? Well, what this group did was they looked at the spinal fluid beta amyloid levels, and they broke it down into 4 groups: low, medium, medium high, and high amounts of plaque in the brain. And then they looked at the spinal fluid levels of soluble beta amyloid, and they found that it didn't matter how much plaque was documented in the brain on this brain imaging, that if you had, there was a kind of a cutoff. If you had a certain amount of soluble beta amyloid in your spinal fluid, you were cognitively normal. So it didn't matter how much plaque there was. The plaque apparently has very little to do with it. And the same group has put out another paper really looking at the physics of beta amyloid plaque. And they explain why it would not be directly toxic to neurons and other brain cells because of the form that it takes. It's all very interesting. And then they also looked at the various studies that have been done with drugs that try to remove beta amyloid from the brain. My husband happened to be in one of those studies, and I'll mention that in a minute. But what they found, these dozens and dozens of drugs that were tested to remove beta amyloid either had no improvement in cognition or actually worsened cognition, accelerated Alzheimer's. And so, they basically have arrived at the conclusion that it's levels of soluble beta amyloid, the type that can become plaque, are actually abnormally low in people with Alzheimer's, not high. So trying to remove it is harmful. This could explain, and probably does explain, why it is harmful to the brain. So it's a little bit out there in the news. That author that I talked to, he said that they have been getting a lot of flack about this. They did have they had difficulty getting the papers published because there were some reviewers that just were adamant that this could not be. It's not possible. One of the reviewers said that he would like to review the data, and they provided all the data to this reviewer, and the reviewer confirmed their data. That in fact, soluble levels are low in people with Alzheimer's. If they're above a certain level, cognition is normal, regardless of the plaque. So they confirmed it, and then they published it. And this is Sturcio is the lead author, Sturchio. And Dr. Espay is the head of the group at University of Cincinnati, ESPAY. And so if you look those up on PubMed 2021 and 2022, you'll be able to find those articles. And then there are others related to that, by the same authors that on the physics and all of that. So very interesting. And what happened with my husband was he was sailing along doing really well. He had steadily improved after starting these medium chain triglycerides, and he was almost at the 2-year mark, but he was in a study. And for a while, we didn't know, we weren't 100% sure, was it just the coconut or had he gotten a miracle drug? But we found out that he was on the placebo for 18 months. And then he crossed over. It was a crossover study. So he crossed over to the drug, and he was on it for probably 6 weeks. And we had a feeling he was on it because his hair started growing out white, which is a really common symptom of side effect of this disease. He had wounds that wouldn't heal. He had like an abrasion on his shin that wouldn't heal for a month. He would nick himself shaving, and it would bleed for 3 or 4 days, and then he fainted. And I decided to pull him out of the study, and it was a good thing. And he did have a setback during that time. He had some new Alzheimer's symptoms. He broke out in a fever blister, and that's kind of relevant because beta amyloid is now known to be antimicrobial. It kills numerous types of viruses and microbes. It could be at play in Alzheimer's. So and then we got a call a few months later, and they said they had stopped the study because when they analyzed the first 18 months of data, they found that people on the drug had accelerated Alzheimer's. It made them worse. And that explained what happened to Steve during just that 6 weeks that he was taking it. So, that was very serious. And that's how these drugs have turned out. There's one out now. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's okay. I've heard that a lot, that there's no really good medication that has any positive benefit, and tons that have all kinds of different side effects.
Yeah, there's one called Aduhelm, Aduhelm, that the FDA approved, I feel it was a little bit over a year ago. They approved for it as long as the people were in a clinical trial that they said, well, there's no hope for Alzheimer's or no good drugs. So even though it had the tiniest little bit of result in one of their 3 studies, they decided to go ahead with it. And the worrisome part, though, is that this drug has a huge, like 40% side effect rate from it, and they're not insignificant side effects. There will be swelling in the brain, though, abnormal collections of fluid and abnormal collections of iron in the brain, in people that take this drug. So it's not benign, and it also costs somewhere between, I've read anywhere from 37 to 50,000 a year. It's an intravenous drug, and yet Medicare won't pay for it unless they're in a clinical trial. So it's and it's only, the FDA originally approved it for all people with Alzheimer's, and then they backed off and said people like at the very earliest stages, could take it. So you're going to give it to people who are at early stage of Alzheimer's, and the potential is that you'll accelerate the disease. That's very scary. So I kind of hope that they go back and withdraw that approval, for now, and really look at this very closely to decide, is it even worthwhile, moving forward with these drugs?
Wow.
And the cool thing too about this study, Espe, Storchio, that group, Precorian's another one, is that the reason I made a connection with them is that there was a study at Wake Forest in North Carolina, and it was comparing in people with cognitive impairment. This was subjective cognitive impairment, when you feel that you have memory symptoms, and people with mild cognitive impairment that are beginning to test abnormal scoring on their cognitive studies. They did a diet study in which the people received 3 different 6-week periods of diet. One was the American Heart Association diet, which is a low-fat diet. The other is a Mediterranean keto diet, which is a high-fat diet, low carb. And then in between the 2 diets, they had a washout period where they were on their usual everyday diet for 6 weeks. And they could be on the diet at the beginning or the end, just to kind of mix it up there, make it a little more blinded. And what they found was when people were on the Mediterranean keto diet, that they had an increase in their spinal fluid beta amyloid.
Wow.
Which correlates with better cognition. So I brought that to their attention. They weren't aware of that study. And so now they are looking at what they can do, how they can study this further, because in their papers, they conclude that some type of drug analog or something should be developed to actually increase beta amyloid, soluble beta amyloid. And if a diet can do it, it'll move along a whole lot faster, so
Wow.
now I believe that they'll be moving forward on that.
Wow, I sure hope so. We just
Yeah.
had Dr. Thomas Seyfried on our show for the 2nd time not too long ago. And the
Anytime.
title of the episode, and then really the topic of our discussion, we talked about fasting. He worked with George Cahill way back in the day when he was first getting
Right.
started, some very influential fasting
Yeah.
studies, which you're very familiar with. But the name of
Yeah.
the episode is called Treating Revenue Driving Diseases. Treating
Yeah.
like these diseases bring revenue
Yes.
into cancer centers and into Alzheimer's centers and all kinds of
Right.
medical systems. And so, how do you treat that with metabolic disease that's going to make people
Hmm.
feel better? And Thomas Seyfried, once you get him like a
I
little bit
do.
wound up about it, he'll just go
Yeah.
bananas against it. But it's so
Yeah.
sad. It's too bad that we're in a system that is designed to generate a lot of money.
Right. I agree with that. Both Alzheimer's and probably even more so for cancer, chemotherapies are extremely expensive.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing there's going to be a cap on Medicare expenses for prescription drugs now, for seniors,
Oh wow.
because I have had friends, people I know on chemotherapies, and they'll often get hit with just exorbitant copays month after month after month for their chemotherapies. Many people just can't afford it. They don't get to get treated for their cancer if they can't find a way to pay for it. It's very
Wow.
unfortunate. And diet doesn't really cost very much, and it
Nope.
actually should be reimbursed. Dietitians should be, and physicians, who counsel people on nutrition, should be reimbursed for that, but that just doesn't happen. It's really a
Doesn't
shame.
happen. It
It'd
is.
be a great payoff, for Medicare and other insurance companies to look into
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really too bad. And I'm so excited to have you on to tell your
Hmm.
story.
Yeah.
I've told your story hundreds of times, and
Hmm.
I feel like
Hmm.
it's at this point like a game of telephone. I maybe tell it slightly
Yeah.
differently, and
Yeah.
it's like maybe evolved. So I'd love to hear the original story. And I'm
Yeah.
so proud too. One of my clients, who I told my client yesterday that I was going to
Hmm.
interview you, and I said, hey, tomorrow I'm going to interview Mary Newport. And as soon as I
Hmm.
said that, he goes, the clocks, and I'm like, yeah, you remembered the
There
clocks.
you go. Yeah.
So we
Yeah.
could
Yeah.
talk all about
Okay.
that in the story, but
Okay.
just before we do,
Mhm.
what is the current state of Alzheimer's? Have we made tons of progress? Is it worse than ever now in 2022? Like what are we dealing
Mhm,
with today?
mhm. Yeah, there still have not come forward any new drugs that can claim that they improve cognition in Alzheimer's. There haven't really been this Aduhelm, that we mentioned already. Is the first drug in something like 15 years that actually got any FDA approval to move forward. The other drugs, basically, they're inhibitors of the enzyme that degrades acetylcholine. Um, Related to that, the acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter in the brain that has to do with memory and learning. It's deficient in Alzheimer's. So the drugs that are approved are aimed to try to increase acetylcholine in the brain. But there haven't, there are just a handful of them. And at best, their studies have shown that they might slow down the disease for up to 6 months and perhaps half the people that take them. But they never claim to improve cognition. They haven't been shown to improve cognition. So um, that's the state of it. I have been following, obviously, the research for a very long time. I watched the conference. Was going to their conference until the pandemic, but watching it the last couple of years. Alzheimer's Association International Conference, and they bring together about 5,000 researchers. They have hundreds of presentations. They have about 3,000 poster presentations, and I was just, once again, not surprised, but still somewhat surprised that there was no new announcement of any new breakthrough in medications, any treatments for Alzheimer's. One of the cool things, though, back when all of this happened with my husband, which we'll talk about, I tried my darndest to get this information to the Alzheimer's Association to get them to acknowledge it. And I even went to a conference about 2 months after it happened, wanted to distribute information. I arranged for a table. They had the article, they approved it, and then at the last minute, they rescinded it. Wouldn't let
Wow.
me have a table, wouldn't let me put out this little case report I had written about Steve. That the intention of the case report was to draw attention to this and to try to encourage funding and research into the ketone ester, which Dr. Richard Beach had developed at the NIH. And they told me, not only can you not have a table, but you can't pass it out at the conference, but you can come to the conference. And we had all the travel arrangements. I had, everything. So we went. And I'll admit, I did sneak it to about 200
Good.
researchers
Good.
there. But yeah,
Sitting in the
but
bush in the parking lot or something, like
yeah,
distributing,
yeah,
like, here you go.
yeah, yeah. And the following year, I talked. We were at Steve and I were at a forum for people. Well, for Alzheimer's, it was in Washington D.C. They go to government offices, senators, representatives, to try to encourage them to get more funding for Alzheimer's research. Basically, is why we were there. But to me, it was an opportunity to kind of meet people like the medical director of the Alzheimer's Association, try to talk with them. And they just were not interested at all in researching this. They said this isn't the type of study they would fund. And not only that, but they were not willing to even mention it or to you know any of the people that come to them for information. And I said, this is a food. It's a food. Um, there was a medical food that was about to be approved that year. It was just C8 MCT oil, caprylic acid, that was already available on the shelf. Bodybuilders were using it. People use it for weight loss. And it's not a harmful drug. It's not toxic. Has been put in infant formulas for decades. Medium chain triglycerides are in human breast milk. But I couldn't convince them um, to acknowledge it, much less study it at the time.
Wow.
And finally, around 2016, they started funding some MCT oil research for ketones. Dr. Stephen Cunnane in Canada, notably, And then some other projects since then, ketogenic diet and MCT oil, other studies by Dr. Kunane. And the first session ever for ketones was 9 years after this happened with Steve, was in 2017.
Wow.
And yeah, and this year there were 4 sessions that had at least a couple of, they had several presentations on beta hydroxybutyrate, the ketone, various aspects of it. Some of the research I hadn't come across myself, but was very interesting, having to do
Interesting.
with the microbiome. There are bacteria in the bowel that produce beta hydroxybutyrate, and it
Wow.
shows up in the brain when that
Wow.
happens.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
so yeah, it is amazing. So
Ketones,
they're finally kind
ketones
of acknowledging it.
ketones are endlessly fascinating. It seems
Yes.
like every day we learn something new and some magical new thing that they
Yeah.
do. It's just so cool to learn about and study. And I think this would
Yeah.
be a nice segue onto how this kind of came
Yeah.
to be
What happened?
your
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
What was a day in the
Yeah.
life like for you and Steve before
Oh,
he started
oh
showing
my gosh.
symptoms?
Before I started showing symptoms. I'm a physician. I did newborn intensive care for 30 years, and that's what I was doing when all this happened. My husband, Steve, was an accountant, and that worked out really perfectly for our family because he actually volunteered. If we were going to have children, he volunteered to stay home, to work from home, which is possible for an accountant. It was unusual in those days, but he was able to work from my medical practice, which was beautiful. Being hospital based, I didn't need another office, and so he just worked from home. And he was the super creative guy. He invented various things. He invented like a rudder for his kayak to make it go straight. When you
Wow.
rode it. He invented, back when I was in medical school. I had to read for about 4 hours every night, and he would like to watch TV with his tiny little apartment. So he invented a thing he could plug into the TV with a headset, so he could listen to the TV silent while I read.
Wow.
And this was in the 1970s.
Yeah, wow. That's
So,
amazing.
I
Smart
mean,
guy.
just, yeah, several things like that. He was an avid kayaker. He was an avid novel reader, loved computers. He had, one of the very first computers, Atari. I remember typing on that.
Wow.
And he always had to have the fastest computer, did all of his accounting work on that. And then he, basically around age 51, I started noticing some things, and it had to do with his memory. He would forget appointments, like our daughters would need, say an eye appointment. They were scheduled for that, and I would call about 30 minutes ahead of time, say, don't forget about the eye appointment. He'd still forget. He'd forget to take them. And I thought, just things like that would happen. And I thought it was just getting distracted, maybe a little midlife crisis or something going on. He would hang Post-its in the doorways on long pieces of tape to try to remind him to do things, and he'd still
Wow.
forget to do them. And then, so about when he was 51, he started forgetting if he'd been to the bank and the post office. And that was his job. He did this every day. And he couldn't remember if he'd gotten mail from the post office, and he would misplace it. It would turn up in all different locations in our garage, which was a gigantic mess. He had started hoarding too. That had been going on for a few years at that point. Later, he told me that he knew he had a problem several years earlier than I caught on. He knew something was up, and he had gotten quite depressed, and took him to a neuropsychiatrist who mentioned dementia, but didn't say, didn't believe it was that. He said it's more likely depression, which can cause memory problems. I think it was actually the other way around. The memory issues, the problems he was experiencing were causing his depression. And all throughout, Steve was always aware, that he had these issues. And then in 2004, things had gotten worse and worse, much worse. We had moved from that location for me to start another newborn intensive care unit about an hour north. And then it became really obvious. He could not figure out how to get around this little small town that has just a few north, south, east, west arteries, and couldn't read a map anymore. He would spend hours and hours in his garage looking for something, and then he'd still be looking for it, but he couldn't remember what it was. It was
Wow.
very strange behavior. And so I took him to a neurologist who was recommended by the local Alzheimer's Association. And he said he thought Steve did have some type of dementia. He did an MRI, which was actually normal at that point. This was in 2004. But he had this test called the mini mental status exam, and it's a 30-point test. And if you're normal, you'll get 29 or 30 points. Steve got 23 points. And there's a drawing that you do. It's this interlocking trapezoid. Steve, it was so bizarre looking, the drawing. It wasn't even remotely close to that. I just remember seeing, the doctor showing me the test, and he said, okay. He said, well, this could be Alzheimer's. He said, but I want to see if it progresses before we put that label on him and start him on medication. Because he said, once you start the medications, if you come off of them, you can get worse much faster. That's one of the problems with these drugs.
Wow.
So 6 months later, we came back, and he had developed a tremor in the meantime, and his score was worse. And he said, he felt that he most likely had Alzheimer's, and there was really no other tests other than autopsy at that point. They couldn't even look at plaque in the brain at that point. So, he was officially diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2004. And it just continued to progress. We had actually, in 2006, switched over to a Mediterranean diet from our convenience food, conventional, high carb, low fat diet. We had been taught, pounded for years by the American Heart Association that we need the low fat. So that's what we were doing. And I had read an article that people on the Mediterranean diet with Alzheimer's, the people who ate the most Mediterranean-like diet lived 4 years longer than the people with the least Mediterranean-like diet. And that was really my first hint that nutrition had anything to do with Alzheimer's. And I kind of researched the whole, all different diets, and I did land on the Mediterranean diet. It looked like it had been the most studied, and it did have some good results. So we switched over to Mediterranean, but he continued to get worse, anyway. And then he had to stop driving in 2006. He couldn't even, this is a man that was on a computer all day doing accounting or playing on it. And he couldn't even remember how to turn on the computer, much less use a mouse or do anything. Couldn't use his calculator anymore. And, it was just clear that he was going downhill very quickly. He would forget.
Is he aware of all of these things as they're happening, or is it not aware? He's aware.
No, he was totally aware.
Oh,
he knew of his diagnosis with Alzheimer's. He knew that he could use a computer. He knew that he could turn it, and he just couldn't remember how to do it. And he was extremely frustrated and depressed, very, very depressed. He was actually suicidal, at times. He had a little bit of hallucinations. He would see little people walking down the roof, and I'd look like, I don't see that, that type of thing.
Wow.
But he knew he had Alzheimer's, and he was very depressed about it. And really all along, he knew what he used to be able to do, what he couldn't do anymore.
It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking for you, the caretaker. It's heartbreaking for him being aware of all of it and feeling that decline. Yeah, it's so tragic. So did switching to a Mediterranean diet help somewhat, or still no?
It was hard to say. It helped me a whole lot because I lost weight. I got much healthier. All those carb cravings went away. I was constantly hungry, and that all went away. And I lost a lot of weight during that time, and I've managed to keep off 60 pounds of that weight.
That's amazing.
So it was great for me. It did improve his blood sugar. He was also in the pre-diabetic range, when we started that, and that did improve also over time. I was pre-diabetic, and that completely resolved it. I haven't had that problem since I went to that style of eating, and then added keto, too. But it's hard to say if it slowed it down. It did progress, and it's just without a comparison to anybody else or being in a study, we really couldn't tell if it had slowed it down at least. But we kept doing it. We just kept doing it.
Gotcha. So when did coconut oil enter the picture?
Yeah, so this was in May of 2008. And what happened was there were 2 new clinical trials that came into our area for 2 drugs. And these were drugs that remove beta amyloid plaque from the brain and reduce blood levels of beta amyloid, the soluble beta amyloid. And the great hope was if you remove these plaques, it would improve cognition. And we thought, oh my God, finally, here's a trial. There hadn't been one in our area for several years. So I set him up to screen for these 2 clinical trials 2 days in a row when I happened to be off work. And the night before the first clinical trial, I thought, what if he gets accepted into both studies? We have to pick one. So I'm looking for the risks and the benefits of these 2 drugs. And I just happened upon a press release, and it happened to mention 3, 3 drugs for basically things for Alzheimer's. And the one, it mentioned the medical food that became Axona. It was called AC1202 at the time. It was still under study and wasn't approved yet. But they had a study, a pilot study of 20 people. And with the very first dose, almost half of the people with Alzheimer's that took it had improved cognition scores.
Wow.
And memory and cognition, which doesn't happen with these drugs. And I thought, it didn't say what it was or how it worked. So I was able to find a patent application, and it was there's a website. It was called Free Patents Online. I'm not sure if they still exist. I haven't been able to find it lately, but I was able to get the patent application. I read through it. It was about 75 pages, and it talked all about Alzheimer's as a type of diabetes of the brain. And this was really the first time I had heard anything about this. And it talked about how glucose uptake in the Alzheimer brain was abnormal, that this was something that started 10 or 20 years before a person developed symptoms, and that it was due to insulin resistance and insulin deficiency in the brain. And I thought, wow, that's very interesting. And the thing about it is that, probably most of your listeners are aware that when you eat something that has, carbohydrate, most of it becomes glucose. And glucose is a fuel for our brain and most of our other cells in the body, but it requires insulin to get into those cells. And if insulin is either deficient or there's insulin resistance in which the cells are not responding, glucose just doesn't get into the cells. So in Alzheimer's, there are certain areas of the brain where this is happening. It starts in the areas with that have to do with learning and memory, and then it just slowly progresses throughout the brain as the disease progresses. It gets worse and worse, and you basically have very, very poor glucose uptake in a big part of the brain during the last stages of Alzheimer's. So the thing about ketones is they're an alternative fuel for the brain. And they are taken up normally in the Alzheimer brain. This is something that research in Canada, Dr. Stephen Cunneen and his group published in 2016. They used ketone and glucose PET scans, and they were able to document the same areas that do not take up glucose normally in the Alzheimer brain do take up ketones normally.
Amazing.
And ketones don't need insulin. They use different transporters. They enter, it's a biochemical chain reaction called the TCA cycle to make an energy molecule called ATP that basically virtually every cell needs to carry out its functions. And glucose actually requires 6 more steps, chemical reactions to get into this TCA cycle than ketones do. Ketones enter more directly. It's a smaller molecule. It crosses very easily into the brain. And so, the idea with that medical food, which was MCT oil, medium chain triglyceride oil, was that it produces ketones, and the ketones from MCT oil would be taken up by the brain and could possibly improve memory and cognition in somebody with Alzheimer's. That was the idea behind the medical food. And I thought, oh my God, this is brilliant. For one thing, I knew what MCT oil was because I'm a neonatologist, a newborn specialist. And we used to add it to the feedings of our tiniest preemies back in the late 70s, early 1980s. And then the formula manufacturers began adding it to premature formulas, MCT oil. And they started adding coconut oil to premature and other infant formulas because it has these medium chain triglycerides, which are in human breast milk. They were trying to mimic human breast milk. So I knew what MCT oil was. And I think if I wasn't a neonatologist, it might have just gotten right past me.
That's what I was wondering. I've actually told people, when I tell people your story, I think I do it incorrectly. I've been telling people that since you worked with babies, you understood that babies were in ketosis most of the
No.
time.
Yeah.
And that was the link between the two, but it sounds like that wasn't
It was the other
necessarily,
way
you were just
around.
familiar. Okay.
Yeah, I was familiar with it. Because we had used it. I had to order it, so how much MCT oil to put in each of the feedings of these tiny babies. These were babies under 2 pounds. And I learned later, when I learned all of this about ketones, then I came across information about that a newborn baby, if the baby is strictly breastfed, will go into ketosis. And they're fat. Human babies are fat compared to other mammals. Human breast milk and the milk of other mammals, cows, goats, have medium chain triglycerides in them. And so, like a woman who breastfeeds knows it takes several days for the milk to really start coming in. There's a little bit there, colostrum, but not very much. And as a neonatologist, I thought, what in the world is the baby living off of those first few days?
Funny.
And but it's their fat, the burning of fat in that condition in ketosis. So some of the fat is being converted in the liver to ketones, and ketones provide energy, something like 75% of the energy to the brain in the newborn. And ketones are the building blocks for lipids in the brain in the newborn. It's very interesting. It converts
Remarkable.
other fats are converted to ketones to build these lipids in the brain. And the brain's about like 60-70% lipids.
Wow.
So I learned that part of it later. But I
Got
knew
it.
about MCT just because we were literally putting it in the feedings of the babies. And
Yeah.
so I knew it was out there. I knew it was out there somewhere. I didn't know I could just get it on Amazon at that point. But in a patent application, I read that medium chain triglycerides the oil is usually extracted from coconut or palm kernel oil. And coconut oil, I'm like, oh, I've seen that in health food stores. And but it was a little, in medical school, I had been taught that coconut oil was an artery clogging fat. And I thought, why is it in health food stores? I used to always wonder that. And I had never really looked into it, but I knew I could get it. And so what happened was I'm reading all of this. It's about 1 a.m. We had to be to the center down in St. Petersburg, Florida at 9 a.m. So I didn't have time to do anything about it. And we went down for his screening. And Steve, he failed. He did not get into the study. He scored only 14 out of 30 points on this mini mental status exam, much worse than his previous testing. And he didn't get in. He needed at least 16 points to qualify. And we were pretty devastated. And the doctor, she had Steve draw a clock. And I actually have a picture of it in my book.
Oh, good. I love this. I love showing people this.
Yes. Okay. So this is what he drew. Can you see it?
If you're listening to this and not watching this, make sure you pull this up and we'll link it in the notes. But yeah, that's not a clock. That is not a drawing of a clock, I would say.
No.
A few circles.
A few numbers.
Few numbers, yeah. But it's kind of like it looks, it just looks like scattered around.
Yeah, it's disorganized. And the doctor told me that he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. So this was really a pretty devastating visit on all counts. And so I knew I had seen coconut oil in health food stores, and there was one in Tampa where I knew I had seen it. So we drove an hour out of our way to get coconut oil. Turns out it was in health food stores all over Spring Hill where we live. But anyway, when we got home, I got on the internet, and I had learned in biochemistry about medium chain triglycerides back in medical school in the 70s, early 70s. So I had to refresh my memory about that. And I had also heard about ketones increasing during starvation. And that's, this was published in the 1960s, late 1960s. Right. Dr. George Cahill, who you mentioned earlier, who I got to actually meet in 2012. It was awesome.
What? Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
He and Dr. Veach and I went to Congress to meet with our my congresswoman here from Florida at that time to try to get more funding for this ketone ester research. So I got to meet him. He looked a lot like George Bush Sr.
Oh, funny.
But it was just intriguing, and it was about 3 years before he passed away. Sadly,
amazing. Yeah,
wonderful man. So where we're okay. So then So I got figured out what medium chain triglycerides are, and then I found a USDA website where you can do a search for pretty much any food, and you can get the breakdown of the composition of the food. And I was able to find the fatty acid composition for coconut oil, and what I learned was that it was 60% medium chain triglycerides. So these are C6 through C12, and the fatty acids are carbon chains, and they're named according to how many carbons are in the chain. So the medium chains, many people consider C6 to C12 medium chains. And it was 60%, coconut oil was 60% medium chain triglycerides. So I calculated how much coconut oil he would have to get to equal the dose of the medical food that people had responded to. And I came up with 35 grams, which is a little over about 7 teaspoons, a little over 2 tablespoons.
Yep.
Okay, so the next day he is scheduled to do the second screening for a clinical trial, and it was in a different town. It was in Tampa, and a different day. And basically, the doctor there had said, yeah, you can try to remind him, day of the week, the season. He gave me a couple little tips. All the way down, I'm trying to get him to remember, and he just couldn't remember. He couldn't come up with the day of the week, couldn't come up with the season. I thought, oh, he's not going to do any better, but I had given him a little over 2 tablespoons of coconut oil it turned about 4 hours before he took the test. And when they took him away to do the mini mental status, they came back and started, doing his blood pressure, talking about drawing blood. And I'm like, what's going on? And she said, oh, he qualified for the study. And his test score came up by 4 points from the day before. Wow. And he qualified. He got it 18. And he did. He remembered, for some reason, it just kicked in. And probably because the ketones from coconut peak at about 3 hours after you eat it.
Wow.
Yeah. So he got the day of the week right, which was a different day. He got the season right. He got the town he was in and the floor that he was on in the institution, which was different than the day before. And he qualified, for the study, and we were elated. He ended up testing again for the other study, and his score went up even more. He got 20 out of 30.
Wow.
When he tested for that one again. We were still trying to decide which study to be in, and you were allowed to try out more than once. So, but then, I thought, okay, is this really the coconut oil, or did we just have a stroke of good luck? I just really wasn't sure. Good day. And I thought, but there's no harm in keeping it up. So, I started buying coconut cookbook. I mean, that day online, I'm getting recipes for how to use coconut oil, and just learning everything I could about it, recipe books. And there's a book called Coconut Cures that I read, and and I thought, the medical food was designed to be given once a day, and that's what the clinical trials were. But they actually said that the level of ketones from MCT oil peaked at 90 minutes and on average, but we're gone after 3 hours. And I thought, well, the brain needs ketones 24/7. The brain's a very active organ. Even when you're sleeping, it's using a lot of energy. So why not give it throughout the day? And with something like coconut oil, it can be easily incorporated into cooking if you, just know anything, a little bit about it. And so, like the next day, and every day after, I just started giving them a little over 2 tablespoons for breakfast, and then cooking with it, adding it. It melts on so many different kinds of warm foods. I would use it in cooking. I cook eggs with it. Started getting coconut milk, getting flaked coconut. We got whole coconuts. We bake them. We just, and luckily we love coconut. So just our life became all about it. But some of the changes that happened those first few days were pretty dramatic. In addition to that, Steve started saying, he said he felt like a light switch came on his head the day he started the coconut oil.
Wow.
And I've had other people say that, not in those words, but they said something changed, something was different, about the way I was thinking that first day. And he, before he started this, in the morning, he would be very sluggish. He'd come out very slowly. He had a weird gait. He couldn't run anymore, but he would pick his feet up and walk real slow, just a strange gait. He had tremors, like when he would try to talk, his jaw would tremor and he would have trouble finishing a sentence, and his hand would tremor when he tried to eat. And he would have trouble like getting silverware out of the drawer, getting the right utensil, when he wanted. He'd come back with the wrong one several times, and he finally get the right one. Couldn't figure out how to get water out of the refrigerator. So within those first few days, all of that changed. He started coming out with more energy, much more talkative, started whistling and making jokes again. He was quite the whistler too. He had these great medleys that he would whistle. And,
Wow.
he just totally felt different. He could get the water out of the fridge. He could get the right utensil. The tremors, the jaw tremor completely went away. We never saw that ever come back. And his hand tremor, he would have it until he had his coconut oil. 20 or 30 minutes later, we would see the tremor would go away, which was intriguing. And so by about the 5th day or so, we looked at each other and we said, something has changed for the better here. And in the meantime, I'm researching everything I can about ketones, and I found on Wikipedia Dr. Richard Beach's telephone number at the NIH, and he was considered the world's expert on ketones. He had worked with Dr. Hans Krebs and helped work out the TCA cycle decades earlier. And at the NIH, he had been working on learning everything about the possibilities of ketones as therapeutics since the 1990s, and had been developing this ketone ester since the 1990s, but it hadn't really gotten the funding that it needed to get mass produced and get clinical trials. So we talked about all that. When I called him, he answered his own phone. And,
Crazy.
yeah. And I had a whole list of questions for him. I didn't tell him what I was doing yet with Steve. I presented it more as a theoretical. And I asked him, I said, do you think that taking coconut oil could help somebody with Alzheimer's? And he said, oh, no, 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 no. He said the ketone levels would be much too low. You would need very high ketone levels. He thought 4 to 5 millimoles, for people that know something about the levels, that would be needed to help somebody with Alzheimer's. And but I knew it had helped Steve, at that point, that I believed it was. And he said that somebody else, another man, had called him several years earlier asking him that same question about MCT oil. And, and he said he had told him the same thing. Well, it turned out to be Dr. Sam Henderson, who had, he's a PhD, and his mother had Alzheimer's. And he had this idea about using MCT oil to help people with Alzheimer's because of the ketone production from MCT oil. So anyway, so I didn't tell him, but he sent me papers. He sent me some of his hypothesis papers. And then 2 weeks after Steve started taking the coconut oil, he had another clock test. And okay, so there it is.
Yeah, again, for the listener, okay, now we've got a circle, we've got the clock face. I do see lines across. So this is starting to look a lot more like a clock. And the thing that always stuns me when I'm showing this is showing them the time difference between the first one and the second one. Wasn't it 15 days?
14 days.
14 days.
14 days. Yeah.
I mean,
So
again, it's still
2 weeks.
It doesn't look like the best clock ever, but it is a vast improvement over the first one.
Right. And then this was 37 days.
Yeah.
So that was a little tidier looking,
Yeah. Now I'm looking at a clock. If I walked across a sidewalk drawing that was done by my neighbor kids or something, I would say they are drawing a clock. I would recognize that. In 35 days. And another thing, I just want to make sure that I understand this correctly. Wow. Yeah. It's so amazing to see the difference. The other thing I just want to point out is, at this point, you guys are still eating a mixed diet. You're not eating a zero carbohydrate or very low carbohydrate ketogenic. You're just simply adding coconut oil to the mixed diet that was already there. Wow.
Exactly. We were eating Mediterranean. Steve was actually eating a whole lot of fruit every evening. He would stand at the sink and eat one piece of fruit after another. And when I look back, at that, I felt like his brain was probably craving sugar. That's why he was eating so much fruit, but it wasn't working. You can have a really high blood sugar, but if it's not getting into those cells, they're starving. Those cells are starving.
That's right.
They're not going to function. So I think that something like that was going on. And not long after we added the coconut oil, he actually stopped eating so much sugar, the fruit, I should say, which was really quite amazing. And then over time, so when the second clock, when he drew that second clock, then I called Dr. Veach and I faxed him the before and after clock, and he called me back and he said, this is unexpected, is what he said.
Wow.
He said he just really didn't think the levels could be high enough to have any, benefit, but something was going on. He said, and then he put me in touch with Dr. George Cahill. He called me. Dr. Theodore Van Italy called me, and Dr. Sammy Hashem. And Dr. Van Italy and Hashem, they were the two who had studied intensively medium chain triglycerides in the late 50s and throughout the 1960s. And they had discovered that MCT oils converted to ketones in the liver. And they had been involved with these recent hypothesis papers along with Dr. Veach, trying to get this information out about the potential for ketones as therapeutics. But the studies had been done a little bit in animals, but not any human studies yet. So they were all so excited that this human with Alzheimer's had responded to, something like coconut oil of all things, that had these medium chain triglycerides in it. And Dr. Hashem and Van Italy both agreed that Dr. Hashem told me he felt like he had always thought that lower levels of ketones could be beneficial, for people with Alzheimer's.
Wow.
So they encouraged me to keep going. And then Dr. Van Italy, he said there could be other things in coconut oil or other reasons why it's helping him too, in addition, because the ketone levels aren't very high. They're pretty minimal. And Dr. Veach did measure Steve's ketone levels, acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate in his glucose level after he took coconut oil. Like he had 2 doses. There were level drawn before and then hourly after each of the 2 doses. Basically, my lab director at the hospital I worked at agreed to do the drawings, and they put them on what do you call that? The liquid nitrogen, to transport to the NIH, and then they ran the levels the next day. And
wow.
It was interesting because with MCT oil and ketone supplements and in starvation, beta hydroxybutyrate levels get much higher than acetoacetate. With the coconut oil, the acetoacetate levels were higher than beta hydroxybutyrate.
Interesting.
Which is interesting. We don't know what it means yet. Dr. Cunane's been thinking a lot about that, and we don't know what it means. Yeah, but beta hydroxybutyrate is converted to acetoacetate before it enters the mitochondria to make ATP. So it could have something to do with that. But anyway, the levels were relatively low. But an interesting thing is that in 2016, this group in Japan, they had me come over, and they were really interested in why Steve would have responded to something with such low ketone levels like coconut oil. And they did a study with lauric acid and the other medium chains in coconut oil. And lauric acid is half of coconut oil, it's C12. So it's on the edge. It has some properties of medium chain triglycerides and some of longer chain triglycerides, but many still consider it a medium chain triglyceride. Well, lauric acid, it turns out, in cultures of astrocytes, potently stimulates ketone production. And astrocytes are brain cells that nourish the neurons in the brain. So it could be that lauric acid and coconut oil acts more directly in the brain to stimulate ketone production. It turns out medium chain triglycerides themselves, well, C8, C10, and C12 all did this to astrocytes. But C8 and C10 are used up very rapidly. They're converted mostly to ketones, especially C8. Whatever is left is used as energy fairly quickly. It turns out that the brain can use those, C8 and C10 directly as fuel. Astrocytes use these medium chains directly as fuel too. In the brain, it's been documented now. C12 hasn't been studied yet, and there's a group they're hopefully going to study that to try to just prove one way or the other that C12 gets in the brain and that it does this directly in the brain. But
That's
that
so
could
interesting.
explain.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that could explain why something with relatively low ketone levels like coconut oil could have such a powerful effect, because it's a more direct effect in the brain of increasing ketones.
Interesting. So I
Hmm.
remember when I first started getting into low carbohydrate, it was probably 2018. I remember
Hmm.
being told that like coconut oil has those three, the C8, the
Hmm.
C10, and the C12, but
Right.
that the two potent ones were C8 and C10, and especially
Hmm.
C8. So I
Right.
stopped eating as much coconut oil and
Right.
started purchasing the
Yeah.
C8 medium chain triglycerides. And for me personally, I couldn't tell the difference between the C8 versus
Hmm.
the C8 and C10 blends.
Hmm.
And so I
Yeah.
just figured like the C8 straight up was kind of a waste of money.
Hmm.
But to this
Yeah.
day, I still do the C8 and C10
Hmm.
kind of combination for MCT oil. I put it in my coffee every single morning. Would I be
Hmm.
better off to go back to just eating coconut oil itself?
Well, what we ended up doing was mixing them. I felt like, okay, coconut oil has, and I didn't know yet about the lauric acid and the astrocytes because this was still only 2008 and it was 2016 when they found that. But Dr. Van Italy, he said, he recommended it, and my gut feeling was to keep the coconut oil going. Yeah, because he said there may be something else in it that we don't know about yet. And I agreed with him, and I didn't want to take that risk of just because Dr. Veach actually did encourage me. He said, just use C8, just forget about the coconut oil, use C8. It's most ketogenic. But I thought, what if he declines again? That's the last thing I wanted to see. So I decided just to mix them, and Steve didn't tolerate C8. He would have diarrhea. He'd end up in the
Yeah,
bathroom. But as soon as he
yeah,
took any C8, but he was fine with C8, C10. So I started adding, um, I started mixing MCT oil and coconut oil together, literally like in the same bottle.
got it.
And I found a ratio of it that it was liquid at room temperature, and it could be used in almost any kind of food because coconut oil tends to chunk up if you put it in anything cold. Like even a smoothie, it will get a little bit chunky. And MCT oil it doesn't even freeze until well below freezing level, of
Right.
water. So you can use MCT oil in pretty much anything. But when you mix them together, you can use it in pretty much anything. The mixture
Mm.
of the two. So I started mixing them together. I still did some cooking with whole coconut oil, virgin unrefined coconut oil,
Virgin
and
unrefined. Okay.
virgin unrefined because there's so many other nutrients. There are these polyphenols that are anti-inflammatory, antioxidants, a lot of vitamins and minerals. That and there could be other substances we don't even know about yet.
That's
So
right.
just kept the whole virgin unrefined to get the maximum nutrition from it. And then I just started increasing it, just gradually increasing it as he tolerated it. And then I would say probably by about 3 or 4 months after we started all of this, that he was probably on a ketogenic diet at that point because he was getting somewhere between maybe 9 and 11 tablespoons a day of this, which is quite a lot of
Wow.
fat.
Wow.
And he had just naturally, he had stopped eating so much of the fruit. He would eat, like berries, blueberries, strawberries, which are relatively low in sugar. He would leave the bread. He'd have a sandwich or a hamburger or something. He would just leave the bread and not eat it. And he would leave the
Great.
rice and the pasta and not eat it. And I thought,
Great.
okay, so I kind of stopped. By that time, I had learned about the Charlie Foundation and ketogenic diet for epilepsy and learned a lot more about that. And I had spoken with our dietitian, Beth Zupakania. We had corresponded, and she encouraged me to try to go more in the keto range. So then I would say several months later that he was on a ketogenic diet, but they didn't have those home monitors yet where you could confirm it. So I don't know absolutely for sure, but strongly
Sure.
suspect. And
Sure.
what we saw through that summer, um, I mean, he just continued to progress. Around 6 weeks after we started the coconut oil, we went home for a visit to our families in Cincinnati. And the years before, he couldn't remember the names of his brother-in-laws that he'd known, for a long time, and nieces. And he was like a wallflower. He just wasn't talking to anybody and not communicating. But this time, he was very outgoing as he usually was. He laughed at jokes. He remembered their names, his brother-in-laws, everybody. He had conversations, and they were like, "What has happened to Steve?" you know,
Wow.
he's better than he was last year. And I brought the clocks with me, and I started showing them the clocks, and they're like, and I told them about the coconut oil, and they go, "Oh my God." And some of his family members and mine started using coconut oil themselves because we all have that history in our family.
Yeah.
And and then that was when I happened to be on that visit, and I saw a news story that the Alzheimer's Association was going to have a conference in July, like the next month. And I'm like, oh my God, I've got this great opportunity to get this information out to 5,000 researchers from all over the world. And then we already talked about the rest of the story that I
Yeah.
did not get to,
No,
I
you
had
didn't.
15. Yeah, I had
Wow.
1,500 copies printed up and prepared to print up more in Chicago. And
Wow.
it was a funny, kind of a funny thing. My sister was out there scouting out things, and she found the press room for the Alzheimer's Association. And I tried to bring the information in there, and they said, no, 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 we can't give anything to the press that hasn't been reviewed by our committees and all this. And I'm like, okay. So we got out in the hall, and here's this young lady who she walked up to me and she says, would you like to do an interview for this Journey Through Alzheimer's documentary that we're putting together? And I'm like, yeah. So I got to show the clocks and tell
Wow.
the story, and it was on this thing. You can't find it anymore online, or haven't been able to find it, but it was
Amazing.
out there for several years. So I was in a documentary for that conference.
Wow. Amazing.
So
That's
they were probably
amazing.
really upset with me about that, but I was willing to do anything to get the information
Yeah,
out.
good for you.
Yeah,
Good for
yeah,
you. I've got two questions. Maybe you can answer
yeah.
both. And I remember I remember like coming across researchers looking at
Hmm.
low carbohydrate or ketogenic diets. I want to say it was for
Hmm.
weight loss, like back in the 1900s, and they
Oh
were
yeah.
saying like I'm going to butcher this. I'm just paraphrasing, but I remember them
Hmm.
saying like there must be an upper limit of meat and fat that we can give these people. We just can't find it. Like there's got to be. We got to be
Yeah.
overfeeding these people at some point, but we don't
Hmm.
we sure can't get there, so we don't know what that is. So my two questions
Hmm.
to you are, first of all, did you ever find an upper limit of coconut oil that was like too much and you needed to
Hmm.
reduce? And then the second question is, when I hear 9 to 11 tablespoons of coconut oil, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of my MCT oil. And if I did that with
Right.
MCT oil, I yeah, that would be very, very, very bad. I had
It
very
would be
close
hard.
calls.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
close
yeah,
calls when I
yeah,
first
yeah,
started.
yeah, yeah,
Digestively, was he able to handle that much coconut oil just fine?
yeah. Well, he handled the coconut oil fine. Like the first day, it was over 2 tablespoons, which some people, 1 teaspoon, and they'll have diarrhea from it. Some people are
Yeah,
just really sensitive. And I think that holds true for other types of oils as well. I took 2 tablespoons, and I don't have a gallbladder, or didn't at that point. And I had major indigestion. I didn't have
gotcha.
diarrhea, but I had indigestion. So I think people are more limited by whether they have side effects from it or not. Um, I haven't really come across an upper limit. Steve is probably the most that I've heard of anybody eating.
Okay,
And it was a mixture, it was a combination. I would say it was probably slightly more MCT than coconut oil, because we did use
gotcha.
some whole coconut oil and other foods. And then, so the other question, remind me again.
No, that was it. You answered both. How did he
Okay,
handle it
okay.
digestively? And if you ever found an upper
Right.
limit, it seems like with the
Yeah, yeah.
process of burning ketones is
Hmm.
so much
Yeah,
supply driven versus demand driven. So it doesn't seem like
yeah.
there would be an upper limit, which is
Right,
amazing.
right.
Now
Yeah.
this would be pure speculation because there's
Hmm.
no way to know what would have happened had you not found all of this. But I
Right.
would argue strongly, and I'm
Hmm.
sure you would too, that
Hmm.
doing this gave him more time on this planet. It sounded
Oh.
like you got more
Hmm.
years out of this. And I think the
Yeah.
length of time is really important. I think
Hmm.
more time is
Hmm.
fantastic. But
Yeah.
I also think more time of 2004 Steve, 2006
Hmm.
Steve,
Hmm.
feeling awful, feeling suicidal, getting depressed,
Hmm.
losing
Hmm.
cognition would not
Hmm.
be fun. That would not be a 4 years
No.
that I would want to do. Of
Right.
course, he would be suicidal in that
Hmm.
situation.
Yeah.
So more,
Yeah.
more so than the time, can you comment on
Hmm.
the quality of life that you
Yeah.
experienced in the time that you had with him?
Right, right. So, I mean, very early on, I mean, within a matter of days, when he felt like the light switch came back on, he also started saying that he had hope. Felt like he had hope again. His depression lifted. It was real obvious, and just his demeanor and personality and how he was behaving, and he just felt much less depressed. Never mentioned suicide again after that. And he could see improvements in himself because like there were things like at 2 months he was able to walk normally again and run. He could run again, you know, and he could tie his shoes again. I mean, think about how simple of a thing that is. You're less than 5 years old developmentally if you cannot tie your shoes. So that's kind of
Yeah.
where he was at that point. he at 3 or 4 months, I think it was close to 4 months after we started the coconut oil, he was on a pretty significant amount of MCTO2, and the amount was much higher at that point. He announced one day that he could read again, and he hadn't been able to read for about a year and a half. And he could not explain it to me, though, why he couldn't read until this happened. He says, I can read again. And I said, why couldn't you read? And he said, it was because the words would look like they were getting into little pixels that were moving around on the paper.
Wow. Wow.
And that stopped. It just stopped one day. And the only indication I had ever had that he had a visual disturbance was we happened to be at a visit at the Alzheimer's Institute, and there was a thermostat on the wall, and he said, look at that thing, it's moving all over the place. And I'm like, I'm not seeing it. I didn't say it, I'm not seeing it, but I'm like, oh, that's interesting,
Yeah.
And
Yikes.
so he had some kind of a tremor, a visual tremor of some sort, that was interfering with him reading, and it stopped. And then he, continued to just gradually do better. And around 9 or 10 months, he would remember what he had read earlier in the day. And he would tell me
Incredible.
things that he had read, and some of it was pretty detailed. He, for example, there was, he had read an article about Einstein in Scientific American. And a few hours later, he told me details about that story. And he would say things, oh, the sunset's really beautiful tonight. It might have something to do with that volcano that we had, that had erupted. And there had been a volcano that erupted a couple of weeks earlier. So he
Wow.
was remembering things, and like a wedding we had been to, he would talk about it later. And so there was a lot of new stuff, and he was doing so much better. He just desperately wanted to work and feel useful again. And so he was able to start volunteering at the hospital that I worked at. He worked in the supply warehouse. He would help move heavy boxes and help deliver things to the various nursing units, usually with somebody else, and then put stickers on supplies. And he felt very useful again. It was just awesome. And so it dramatically improved his quality of life. And he had some setbacks, like I told you. It was almost 2 years after he started the coconut oil. From that clinical trial, he got worse.
Yeah.
He had a big setback, and that was when Dr. Beach came to the rescue. He is my hero, because the ketone ester had passed toxicity testing, and the FDA had allowed it for basically athletes, who for 5 days, young, healthy people to use for athletic performance for 5 days at that point. But Dr. Beach felt like that was enough to do a pilot study for Alzheimer's, and Steve was chosen as the first person with Alzheimer's to get this ketone ester as a pilot study. So it appeared on our doorstep one day, and he sent me the raw material. It tasted horrible. It tasted like jet fuel. It was just undiluted ketone ester. It just, I
I've heard
can't
it's
tell you,
terrible.
I can't tell you how bad it tastes.
Yeah.
And then I had to figure out how to make it palatable, and they suggested diluting it like like 3 parts water, 1 part the ester. And then I tried all different kinds of flavorings. And Steve, he knew he had Alzheimer's. He knew what it was. He'd been waiting for it himself, and he drank it and he shuddered, And he, within 2 hours of taking it for the first time, he was just determined to write out the alphabet, which he hadn't been able to do, to say it and to write it out. And it took him over and over. He just, on his own, tried and tried and tried and tried. He finally finished writing out the alphabet, and he said the alphabet. And he was ecstatic because he hadn't been able to
Wow.
do that for quite a long time. He was euphoric almost. I mean, just in a fantastic mood. And part of the setback we had was that he needed a lot more help just doing basic care for himself. And what I mean by that is he had gone from being able to really dress himself, take a shower, shaving without thinking about it. He had, with the setback, he needed step-by-step guidance to take a shower. So what that means, what that meant was I would have to stand with him. He's in the shower, I'm standing there telling him, okay, now get your hair wet. Okay, now rub the shampoo in.
Wow.
Okay, now rinse it out, and just step by step through the whole thing. Same thing with shaving, same thing with brushing his teeth.
Wow.
And when he took the ketone ester the very next day, he just got in the shower and took it, shaved, picked out clothes, put them on. They weren't backwards or upside down, which they often were. And he said, I can do things again. I
Wow.
can do things again is how it was to him. And we saw that in many other things. And over about 6 weeks, basically nearly everything new that had happened during that setback was reversed. He was
That's
kind of
amazing.
back to square one. And then he went on for about 20 more months like that. So it was altogether close to 4 years that he had
Wow.
a better quality of life. And then sadly, what did happen was well, first he had a hospitalization related to a medication reaction. It was Valium. We had, there was a geriatrician here in our area who he has a big sign that says that he trained at Johns Hopkins, that he's an Alzheimer's expert. And I thought, oh, wow, this would be the guy to hook Steve up with, as a physician. And so we went to him. And at that point, Steve would have an occasional night where he would say, this isn't where I live. Take me back to my place when it was time to go to bed. And we go through this for like an hour, and then I'd finally convince him, well, it's kind of late. Why don't you just lay down here and we'll look for your place in the morning? And then he'd go to
Mm,
bed. So we were having some things like that going on. It's really common in Alzheimer's. And so this doctor said, well, let's just give him the like half of the lowest dose of Valium, and that'll probably calm him and he'll probably go to sleep easier. And the first 3 weeks he took it, he was fine, but then he broke out into like a dripping sweat one day, and then he started pacing and pacing, and he was calling my name like 200 or 300 times a day, and it wasn't very happy. It was really strange, very strange. And I didn't quite know what was going on, but it seemed like some kind of a toxic reaction. But he had a severe night terror that was frightening. He threw like a Tiffany lamp against the wall. And I mean, he had never, ever done anything like that. And it was really frightening. And he ended up in the hospital, which I wish hadn't happened to this day. But they started giving him drugs like Haldol and Abilify and other things. And he had like a really severe reaction to it. This massive sweating and diarrhea and confusion. And he went from being fully upright, talking well, feeding himself, totally continent, to exactly the opposite. They wouldn't let him get out of bed. He was restrained. He developed a really severe tremor from these medications. And then, this fever and these just massive sweating episodes. And it turned out he was having a reaction to Haldol. It's called neuroleptic malignant syndrome. And he was getting
mm.
worse and worse. And I'm the one researching this. They're not, people there didn't seem to be at all surprised. Or, I was told later that one of the nurses had said to a sitter that I ended up hiring to help with Steve, she told him that he was dying and I was in denial.
Wow.
Well, he wasn't dying when he came in, you know.
Yeah. Wow.
So I ended up taking him home, and it was Haldol. And Steve, it turned out he had Lewy body dementia as well as Alzheimer's, and Lewy body is well known to have extreme sensitivities to certain medications like Haldol. Um, so that was most likely the cause. But he did, over about 6 or 8 weeks, he recovered quite a bit from that. It was very hard to get ketone ester, enough of it, into the hospital, much less the coconut and MCT oil. I'd bring him smoothies and I'd bring him, but it was very hard, for him to get the amount that he was getting at home. So
Yeah.
once he got home, we kind of went back to all of that. And then about a year later, for the first time ever, he had a seizure. He was doing a lot better at this point, but he had hugged me, told me he loved me. I went off to work. He's standing and he fell straight back and hit his head, and he went into a really severe seizure. I had a lady with him, and she called me and said she had just called 911, that he had stopped breathing. He was blue and was having a seizure. And the seizure lasted for 20 minutes. He had another one on the way to the hospital. And after that, he was completely dependent.
Wow.
So that just abruptly changed everything. And then he still lived for another 2.5 years after that. But he needed help. He needed help with eating, and he really couldn't walk. I mean, he could walk, but he needed a whole lot of assistance, and it was very not very safe for him to even attempt to walk by himself. So he did pass away from Alzheimer's in 2016, early 2016.
Wow.
Eventually, it will get, in his case, apparently it gets to the brainstem, and then his breathing changed, and he just became unconscious, and then he passed away
Wow.
after that. Yeah.
Wow. Well,
So,
so sorry
but
for your loss. And obviously,
yeah.
that's a very terrible and tragic thing to have happen. Did you take
hmm
any hope or solace away from that situation? And did that give you more peace that you at least had found something that gave him a better quality of life while he was around?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I felt like we had gained almost 4 better quality years than the year before we started it, and it did give him hope again, and for good reason, because his life was better, for several years. And but I also felt like he was fairly advanced. He was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's when we started this, and that many people out there are at the earliest stage of the disease, or they are at risk for it, and that this gives other people an opportunity. And Steve's legacy to me is the many other people who could benefit from this. And the research, I do feel like it stimulated research. I got involved very quickly with Dominic D'Agostino, who had just come to
Amazing.
University of South Florida near us, and we visited his lab a number of times. And it spurred some research there, that the ketone ester. He became aware of it because of a story that ran in our local paper about Steve, and he connected with us, after he read that. And he was focusing on ketogenic diet. He wasn't aware of the ketone ester at that point, but so we connected, and we're still very connected, I would say.
That's great.
So, he wrote the
Wow.
foreword for my book.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Dominic
I,
and Milady Brown. Yeah.
I love it. Wow. Well, I'm so glad you used the word legacy
Yeah.
because that occurred to me as well. He left
hmm
something behind that's now helping so many
Right.
people, which
Right.
is incredible. Any one of us would love to have that said about us
hmm
when we leave this earth, that people used our lives for some kind of help. And again, terribly
Yes.
tragic that you had to go through it, but amazing
hmm
now that you get to share your message. At what stage, at what point of life should
hmm
somebody
hmm
start thinking about these things and Alzheimer's disease? Do we wait until we're 60? Should we start when we're 20? And
hmm
what things do you recommend that people do? Is it simply that you
hmm
recommend that more people have more of the coconut oil, more MCT oil,
hmm
or what should
hmm
people do and when should people start?
Yeah. So, you can start at any age, but the sooner the better. And I think about infants in breast milk, and even in infant formulas, they're getting medium chain triglycerides, and they're getting ketones, and it gets lost. Like this whole thing about eating a low fat diet, eating low fat dairy. If you're doing that, you're not getting any medium chain triglycerides. And the brain does use ketones. Other organs in the body, the heart and kidneys, love ketones, it
That's right.
turns out, on ketone PET. So our whole body and brain can benefit, throughout our lives. So I think, trying to incorporate some foods that have these medium chain triglycerides is very important. I think another huge thing is getting away from eating so much sugar. That's been a huge problem. Obviously, epidemics of obesity, diabetes, and dementia have just steadily gotten worse since all these low-fat diet guidelines have gone into being. And many manufacturers, I mean, they produce all these fat-free foods, reduce fat this, reduce fat cheese, everything, and it eliminates this possibility that we'll ever be in ketosis.
That's right.
Sugar itself is very harmful. This is something as time went on, and I started writing, and kept reading and reading about this, and its insulin resistance is a big part of the problem in the Alzheimer brain. Um, Whatever you can do to overcome insulin resistance is very important. And Dr. Eric Westman, for example, at Duke University, he has helped over 4,000 people with type 2 diabetes, which is insulin resistance,
Yeah.
basically go completely into remission. They get off their insulin, off their meds, and all of this. And it's a very low carb, higher fat diet is what they're eating, to do this. Um, and now there are some case reports. I have them in my book, and I've put them out other places, presentations of people who have Alzheimer's and diabetes or insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, that have completely improved from abnormal, like mini mental status scores, 21, 23, to normal, 28, 29, up in the normal range. And reverse, their diabetes, getting completely back to a normal hemoglobin A1C, normal fasting blood sugar within 10 weeks of going on a ketogenic diet.
Remarkable.
Yeah, and the program, like in these case reports, they also did exercise, they did some mental training and that type of thing too. And then other studies that I mentioned earlier, Mediterranean keto diet it will reverse these trends towards insulin resistance in the opposite direction. And you can see that in the blood, the biomarkers, the hemoglobin A1C, fasting blood sugar, fasting insulin levels all, dramatically improve, with the keto diet. And sugar itself, when it's chronically elevated, we tend to produce in the blood advanced glycation end products. And they're these sticky, harmful molecules. They're very inflammatory. They can form on DNA and RNA, proteins, lipids, and really muck up the works. I think of it as mucking up your metabolism, because it can damage these tissues and probably are responsible for a lot of the complications that happen in people with diabetes, the blindness, kidney failure, problems with circulation in the skin, peripheral neuropathy.
Yeah.
And so, I think cutting down on sugar is extremely important and finding some way to get in ketosis. And that could be many different things. Overnight fasting is very popular. If you fast for at least 12 hours or so, you will start producing ketones, and the longer you extend it, the higher the levels will get. Exercise, moderate exercise for 30 or 40 minutes will stimulate ketone production. And there are some studies out there that they were done actually as early as the 1930s or so, showing that these levels of ketones could be elevated for 7, 8, 9 hours after you exercise.
Yeah.
So that's even without diet. But if you add medium chain triglycerides, coconut oil, you can further increase ketones. And I suggest people add those to their food. It will kind of help maintain a steady level of ketones, mild nutritional ketosis, reducing the sugar, that will help even more, increasing other fats in the diet. And then, of course, there are ketone supplements too, like people that feel like they want a further boost in ketones. And I do this myself, but you can take a ketone supplement and get your levels up quite a bit higher temporarily, for several hours, which may have benefit as well. I know there's some studies going on now for ketone salts, and there's one that the National Institute of Aging is doing with a ketone ester. People that have metabolic syndrome and are at risk for cognitive impairment, they're studying, I believe they're getting ketone ester for about 6 months, and the study's supposed to be done in 2023. So finally, Dr. Veach is getting some studies done, and he did pass away. He was 84, still working at the NIH when he passed away in early 2020. So he didn't get to see the final fruits of it, all of his work. But so I'm carrying on Dr. Veach's legacy as well. I feel like, trying to push it forward.
Yeah, that's so amazing. I absolutely love that. And part of that is your new book. Can you tell us a little bit about Clearly Keto?
Yeah, so this is the book.
It's a thick book, by the way.
Ooh, it's very, very, I couldn't stop writing. This is what I did with my pandemic vacation.
Good for you. The cover was the first thing I noticed on social media, maybe like a month ago. The cover's beautiful.
Oh, I love the cover. I'm thrilled with it. My publisher, there was a kind of a turnover of people, and they came up with this cover, and I'm like, yes, finally a cover that I love, So,
I love it.
So it took me about 16 months to write, and the last chapter, I spent the first 10 months writing, and it's about what goes wrong in the Alzheimer brain. And I wrote it, so that the average person who's interested in science should be able to read it and understand it. But also, so that researchers and doctors who want an overview of, what's going on might find it interesting. And it's tons of references, well over 100 references just for that one chapter.
Wow.
But I look at each cell type and what happens to each cell and the different pathologic processes that are going on in the brain, inflammation, insulin resistance. There's a problem with the brain energy gap. There's a gap between how much energy your brain needs and how much it gets, even if you're cognitively healthy in older people. It just gets worse with mild cognitive impairment and much worse with Alzheimer's. So it's almost like a continuum there. So I explain all of that. And then where ketones could fit in to kind of help overcome insulin resistance and fill in this brain energy gap and reduce inflammation, which is what ketones do. But then the first part of the book is really dedicated to understanding how and putting it into practice, a Mediterranean style whole food ketogenic diet. I explain how it can be adapted. Some people don't realize you can adapt almost any diet to a ketogenic diet. I mean, even a junk food diet could be a ketogenic diet, but not a good idea. But so this is a Mediterranean keto, and there's information about ketone supplements, other supplements that I feel make sense that you might not be able to get if you're eating like a ketogenic diet. You might be missing certain nutrients. And then I have several chapters on things beyond keto. There are many things that people can do to try to prevent Alzheimer's disease and to enjoy healthier brain aging. There are studies now, and they've been presenting this at the Alzheimer's Association, that like in the US, they believe 40% of cases of Alzheimer's are preventable by making good lifestyle choices. Wow. 40%.
Yeah.
And number one is diet, a healthy diet. Number two is exercise. And then others are controlling high blood pressure, treating, like evaluating for and treating sleep apnea. Apnea is a well-known cause of dementia. Greater social engagement, keeping your mind active, those types of things. And then I go into other things, beyond that, like certain medications. We talked about how the Alzheimer's drugs try to increase acetylcholine in the brain. Well, there are a whole lot of over-the-counter drugs and prescription drugs that decrease acetylcholine in the brain. They're anticholinergic, and there's things like decongestants, antihistamines, certain antidepressants. There are a whole lot of medications, things that help with bladder control, and a lot of elderly people are taking several of these, for the different symptoms that they're having. So if you're taking an Alzheimer's drug to increase acetylcholine, but you're taking other drugs that will decrease it, you're not doing yourself any favors there. So there's a section on that. There's a section on certain minerals, like getting iron. You need a certain amount of iron, but too much can be very harmful. If you think of rust, it's not exactly rust in your brain, but it's a similar process, oxidation, and it can actually be harmful to get too much iron. And too much zinc can be very harmful. A lot of people, they'll pop a lot of zinc, different sources, and that can be, your body, you need zinc, your brain needs zinc, but it doesn't, excessive amount isn't good. So just a lot of different things like that, that people can do, little tweaks and foods that they eat and other things they take that could possibly help prevent Alzheimer's or, cognitive impairment as you get older. So that's what the book is about.
That's amazing. Wow. Very comprehensive and well done. I have to say, I'm looking forward to two books at the end of this year that are coming out at pretty close to the same time. One is yours and the other one is from Dr. Chris Palmer, which should be another really amazing.
Yes.
Yeah, dude, I think everybody in the low carbohydrate space is really excited about both of those, and yours is one. And I just have to point out, like we just went 90 minutes in this podcast nonstop. You're out writing books. You are so aware and alert, and you're crushing it and sharing amazing information. If nothing else, if nothing else, that should be a good indication for the listeners or people watching that they should adopt this type of a lifestyle if they want to age well. Like you said, you lost a bunch of weight and were able to keep it off. You're strong. You're very, very smart, able to talk and share about all this. Why not just try this? It's not going to kill you to try. See if you feel better. All of those different conditions that you mentioned are amazing. And that says nothing for like, oh, and I don't snack anymore, and my skin cleared up, and I don't have brain fog, and I don't need a nap at 2. There's so many benefits to this way of life. And I hope that is yours and Steve's legacy moving forward. I'm so glad you used that word, and I think it's a wonderful way to celebrate his life and a wonderful way to celebrate your amazing research and this message that you're sharing throughout the world. And I hope that makes you very proud.
It does. Thank you very much. I have, like, from the day he started it, I started doing it too for prevention, and I felt like I did have greater mental endurance, fairly early on, and I'm 70 now. I'm not like elderly, but I feel great, and no prescription medications. My blood pressure is good. My hemoglobin A1C is perfect, and I just I am feeling it, and I want other people to be able to experience the same thing.
Love that. Wow. I
Mhm.
absolutely love that. Well, this has been just an amazing and very
Yeah.
special conversation. I've been looking forward to chatting with you for a very long time. Dr. Mary Newport, where would you like people to go to find you, connect with you in your work, and
Mhm.
pick up the book?
Yeah, so on my website, Coconut Ketones, and for those who don't know, it's Ketones. There's no Y in ketones. You can look, I have a page for Alzheimer's and dementia. I have a page for getting started on the keto diet. There are videos. There's some articles I've written about ketone esters, ketone salts, MCT and coconut oil, mixing it, scientific articles, a whole slew of them related to ketones and the MCT oil studies. And it's all free printable material. There are links to my books on there. So, but the books are on Amazon and a whole lot of other book websites. Turner Publishing, they're my publisher. They have a really good price for the book too, so you can go directly to their website. But that's how, and there is a contact on my website. My sister Angela helps with a lot of my emails, so your first response might be Angela, but if you have particular questions for me, it will get to me. And
Yeah.
uh, so that's how you can reach me.
That's amazing. We'll make sure we link to all of that in the show notes. As we said in the introduction, that website is just a treasure trove of amazing
Mhm.
educational resources and such a cool collection of all of it kind of coming together. So, like I said, we'll
Thank
definitely link
you.
to that in the show notes. Dr. Mary Newport,
Mhm.
again, thank you so very much for all of your
Thank,
research and thank you for taking time to be on our show
mhm.
today. It was such an honor to host you.
Thank you so much, Casey. I really appreciate your asking me to come on.
Absolutely. It was such an honor. And this has been another episode of Balanced Body Radio.